a lot of there are a lot of Mefarshim who want to know what the word vayavo means, which I thought was one of the simpler words. A lot of Mefarshim aren't sure what that means. And in fact, I'm going to present three, which give three different ideas. The first is a Rashi, which it's my favorite Rashi of all time because it's only two words. And therefore, I'm pretty sure I understand it. Vayavo Avraham, Rashi says, Mi be'er sheva. I love it. Very clear. It's the first Rashi that I think is actually pshat, because if you read the psukim, a few psukim before Chayyei Sarah, we have the sentence, Vayashav Avraham el ne'arav, Vaykumu vayechu lachtav el be'er shava, Vayeshev Avraham be'er shava. And that the next time we hear of Avraham is here. So if you follow pshat, as Rashi does very clearly, Avraham was in Be'er Shava until the death of Sarah. Now, if you believe that the death of Sarah occurred very soon after Akedat Yitzchak, this makes total sense. However, if you would to follow that perhaps there is some time that's elapsed here, then we get into difficulty. What if 1 year has passed? What if, as some of these people say, a couple of decades have passed? Then why was Abraham so far away from Sarah for so long? So let's go into the next Mefarsh I want to introduce you to it, and it's Shadal. I'm going to tell you what Shadal says, and then I'm going to actually introduce you to Shadal as a side note, because I think he's an interesting commentator for JTS students specifically to know about. So Shadal starts off with Vayavo Avraham as a response to Rashi, who says, Ulai mi be'er sheva. Maybe it's mi be'er sheva. So maybe there's a pshat going on. But then he talks about the decades and the things that said. And Sophia mentioned one option that perhaps Yitzchak was about in his 20s at this point. So here's a different idea from the Mefarshim. Mizeh shaya Yitzchak b'sha'at hakedah ben 37 shana. Sorry. Okay. Because we know, or he believes that Yitzchak was 37 when the Akedah happened, and we know that a lot of years have passed. Many years have passed since the Akedah until now. And Abraham must have been in Be'er Sheva until now, which creates a problem that we have to deal with. Why was Abraham separated from Sarah for so long? So according to the Ramban, the Shadal says, Sarah had her tent. And there she sat with her, basically her kin. So each of these different people had their own tent. We can call it a house on an estate if you were imagining the uber wealthy. Sarah died in her own respective tent. So he is saying, well, okay, one option is what Rashi says. Abraham and Sarah were separated by miles. But what about if they were separated by tents? Then vayavo is a nicer term, and it means that Abraham was there the whole time, and all he had to do was go from one tent to the other tent. And therefore, he was always there to comfort her as she was close to death. So I find that a much more kind attribution to Abraham and a much gentler way of reading the text. Before I get to the Shadal, I want to bring in the third option, which is the Rashbam, Rashi's grandson. And he says, Vayavo Avraham, afilu lo ba mimakom acher, af al pichen ra'ui lomar kiva lespoda. So even though he takes it for granted that Abraham does not come from Be'er Sheva, so even though he doesn't come from a different place, still, what we have here is that the pasuk had to say that he came to mourn her. That is the important part, not the vayavo, but the lispoda v'lifkota. We're going to come back to that in a second. Before we come back to that, I just want to quickly introduce the Shadal, because he lived a lot more recently than I thought. He was actually born in 1800 and died in 1865, which was the last year of the Civil War. But he was in Italy, not the US, but still, that's pretty recent. Shadal was educated in an Italian Jewish community that was open to general education alongside a Jewish one, JTS. His elementary education included Bible, Mishnah, mathematics, geography, history, Italian, French, and German. And in his teens, intensively studied Latin. His research and literary activities began in his early teens, and he completed studying the entire Talmud at age 17. So guys, get your life together. So I bring him up because when he was living and when he was doing a lot of his work, the Haskalah was taking place, and there was a radical reforming going on in the Jewish community of Europe. And I use the word reforming literally. The reform movement grew up around him. And I find that interesting to note that one of his things is he had a very traditional background, and he was dealing with a lot of Peshat, but around him, Jews were kind of drifting apart. So on a side note, unrelated to this drash, I just think that he's someone interesting to know for us and our future, and perhaps as a way to connect with Jews who are changing around us as well. Now, I'd like to go back to the Rashbam's focus on the word vayispoda lifkota, because when I mentioned why the title Chayyei Sarah does not work for me, is because when you think about Chayyei Sarah, the genre you would expect is something that is possibly a flashback to the past. We are recounting her life, but that's not what we're doing. We start not only after her death, but we start focusing on what happens afterwards. We're focusing on the future. The first thing that happens is the mourning process, and we pass over that very quickly, but we could assume that that takes a long time. After the mourning process, we have the whole thing with the Ma'arach HaMachpelah. I realized that we're actually shorter on time than I thought. Dr. Cooper, should I skip a bit? You're muted. I'm sorry. Yeah, I should skip a bit. Okay. So I had a lot more to say. I brought in the rough Sadia Gaon and other things, but I'll skip all the way to basically my point. And unfortunately, you're not going to. Sorry, you're muted, Dr. Cooper. I can't hear you.
Please don't skip. But if anybody simply has to leave, then they should just leave. But I'm recording you now.
Great.
So
Thank you.
I missed the first minute or two, but they can come back and listen to it.
Okay. So if anyone needs to leave, please feel free to do so. I'm also happy to tell you what happens after. But so the tension that is being felt here isn't simply where Avraham is coming from, but also what is going on after she dies. If there is a lot of time, then the lifkota, lispoda, lifkota seems a little bit tertiary. If they had spent decades apart, now he's coming to cry over her, then you could ask the question, well, where were you when she was alive? But if we could say that Avraham went from one tent to the other, then the next question, which is not being dealt with in this devar Torah, but one that you could deal with yourselves, I want you to think about this is, why do we not know what happens after Akedat Yitzchak till now? If we're dealing with Sarah, why do we not know what she thought about Akedat Yitzchak? Why isn't that something the Torah tells us? Anyways, on that note, by the way, is where's Yitzchak in the story? But since Sophia beautifully spoke about that, I'm going to not spend too much time. Now, I want to go back to the genre and discuss the exegetical differences between these three statements. So on a deeper level, I wonder how important the question is where Abraham was, because if that was important, then the Torah would have made it a little bit clearer. And to that point, I want to bring in Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon on the words Lispod L'Sara Livkota says, Zeu chelek ma'advarim shechayav adam lasot al moto. Now he is talking about the most important part in his mind, which is the end, not the ve'avo, but what Abraham did once he arrived. And he is exegizing that what we learn from here is how to act accordingly once someone who you loved passes away. You must give a eulogy and cry over it. And then he actually lays out how to do it day by day. Hesped yom echad. On the first day, you were supposed to mourn. Shloshet yamim livchi. You cry for the next 3 days. Sheva yamim le'inyan kivus begadim v'tasporot. So that's with like the more physical aspects of the mourning process, what we would call avelut today. And then shloshim yamim v'likanes l'simcha. Al av ve'em shana. So what he's basically saying is, let's not focus on where Avraham was, but let's focus on what we can learn from once he arrived. Because we know what comes next is he's very careful about getting the right cave for the right price. And then he tries to figure out the future. So if we could possibly think about this for a second as a new title, I would like to suggest one that I'm sure isn't all that new, and maybe some of you have thought of, but instead of Chayyei Sarah, what we really have here is a parsha about mitat Sarah. It's really dealing with the consequences of her death and how that affects Avraham specifically. He's not worried about the past, he's worried about the future. He cries, He mourns, and in the period of crying and mourning, he must deal with her estate. He buys the proper cave, not only for her, but if you really read the verses, he's buying one that could fit him, his children, and his upcoming family members who aren't even born yet. So to him, the death of Sarah doesn't help him to understand her life, but to properly plan for the future of his family. Thank you for listening.
Yes, go off.
Thank
Since
you.
you've hung around this long, anybody who have any particular comments?
Are your sources, Rafi, posted on the discussion board?
I'm sorry, keep that again.
Are your sources posted on our discussion, like all the ones you've discussed?
No, so I actually wrote a different thing for this week's discussion, not knowing that I didn't have to do both. And then I posted, once you said, Dr. Cooper, that Sophia had posted, I posted a second time with the basics of what I was going to talk about. But I didn't write the actual specific, what they said, but the names of the people are there. I say Rashi, Shadal, and Rashbam on the thing I posted second time. If you'd like to know if you'd like to know more, I could send you the actual thing so you can read them. But they're on the first